What if the stories passed down by the Aztecs weren't just myths, but echoes of real, earth-shattering events? Imagine standing in the heart of ancient Tenochtitlan, listening to elders describe worlds destroyed by jaguars, hurricanes, and fire from the sky, not as mere legends, but as warnings from the past. The Aztec creation story speaks of 5 suns, each representing an era that ended in catastrophe, only for humanity to rise again. But what if these weren't just divine tales? What if they were memories of actual disasters, volcanic eruptions, floods, or even cosmic events woven into myth over centuries? Today, we're peeling back the layers of time to ask a startling question. Could the Aztec creation myth be a coded history of real cataclysms? From the ruins of Teotihuacan to the symbols hidden in ancient codices, we'll uncover the clues that suggest these stories might be more than just sacred lore. Stay with us, because by the end of this journey, you might never look at mythology the same way again. Now, let's step into the heart of the Aztec creation myth itself, a tale as intricate as it is awe-inspiring. Picture a universe not born once, but shaped through cycles of destruction and rebirth. At the center of this story are the 5 suns, each representing an era that rose and fell in spectacular fashion. The first era, the Jaguar Sun, ended when monstrous jaguars devoured humanity. Then came the Wind Sun, shattered by hurricanes so fierce they swept people off the earth. The third, the Reign of Fire Sun, met its doom in a storm of volcanic flames. Next, the Water Sun drowned the world in a great flood. And finally, we arrive at our current age, the Motion Sun, where the gods demanded a heavy price to keep the cosmos alive: human blood. But here's what makes this myth so gripping. It wasn't just about destruction, it was about sacrifice. The Aztecs believed their gods paid the ultimate price to create the world. Take the story of Nanahuatzin, the humble god who threw himself into a sacred fire to become the sun. Without his act of courage, the universe would have remained in darkness. And this theme repeats: gods battling, dying, and rebirthing the world through their struggles. What's fascinating is how deeply cyclical this world view was. The Aztecs didn't see time as a straight line, but as a wheel, turning endlessly through creation and ruin. Every catastrophe wasn't just an ending, it was a necessary step toward renewal. And woven into this tapestry of divine conflict was humanity's role: to honor the gods through ritual, ensuring the fragile balance of existence held firm. So, as we unravel these layers, keep this question in mind: could these vivid stories of jaguars, storms, and floods be more than myth? Could they be echoes of real events, etched into legend? That's where our journey takes us next. Now, let's take a step back and ask why any of this matters. Why should we care whether ancient myths might be rooted in real events? Well, think about it like this: stories are more than just entertainment. They're how cultures make sense of the world, especially when faced with events so massive, so terrifying. They defy ordinary explanation. Take the Great Flood, for example. Nearly every ancient civilization, from the Mesopotamians with their Epic of Gilgamesh to the Bible's Noah, has a story about a catastrophic deluge. And here's the thing: modern geology actually supports the idea that many of these myths could trace back to real floods, like the flooding of the Black Sea around 7,000 years ago. These weren't just tall tales, they were warnings, memories, ways of saying, this happened before, and it could happen again. So when we look at the Aztec creation myth, with its cycles of destruction, jaguars, hurricanes, fire, and floods, it's worth asking, could these be more than just symbolic? Could they be echoes of actual disasters that reshaped their world? Imagine a time when early humans witnessed volcanic eruptions so vast they blotted out the sun, or storms so violent they wiped entire villages off the map. Without science to explain these events, what else could they do but turn them into stories of gods and cosmic battles? And that's where the real intrigue lies. If these myths do hold fragments of truth, then they're not just ancient legends, they're historical records in disguise. They're clues left behind by people who lived through unimaginable chaos, trying to make sense of it all. So as we dig deeper into the Aztec creation story, keep that possibility in mind, because if their myths were based on real events, what else might they be trying to tell us? Now, let's turn our attention to the very first era in the Aztec creation myth, the Jaguar Sun. According to the legend, this age ended when monstrous jaguars descended from the sky, tearing humanity apart. But what if this wasn't just a story? What if it was a distorted memory of something far older, something real? Picture this: tens of thousands of years ago, early humans shared the Americas with terrifying predators. We're not just talking about modern jaguars, but massive creatures like saber-toothed cats, giant short-faced bears, and dire wolves. Fossil records show these beasts roamed the same landscapes as humans, and encounters with them would have been deadly. Imagine stumbling upon a saber-toothed cat in the wild. Its sheer size and power would have been the stuff of nightmares. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. The Aztec myth describes the Jaguar Sun's destruction as a time when the sky itself seemed to unleash these beasts. Could this be a cultural memory of a time when humans lived in constant fear of these predators? Some researchers even suggest that the myth might reflect the extinction of Pleistocene megafauna, those giant animals that vanished around the same time humans spread across the Americas. The sudden disappearance of these creatures would have been just as shocking as their presence, leaving behind stories of divine punishment or cosmic battles. And there's another layer. Jaguars weren't just feared in Aztec culture, they were sacred, symbols of power and the night. So if early humans witnessed the decline of these great predators, it's no surprise they'd weave them into their myths as forces of destruction. The legend of the Jaguar Sun might not just be about animals, it could be about humanity's own struggle to survive in a world ruled by giants. So next time you hear about the Jaguar Sun, think beyond the myth. Think about the bones buried in the earth, the fossils that tell their own story, because sometimes the most terrifying legends are the ones that might just be true. But the story doesn't end with the Jaguar Sun. As the Aztec myth tells it, the world was reborn only to face another cataclysm. This time, the destruction came not from beasts, but from the sky itself. Enter the era of the wind sun, an age said to have ended when hurricanes of unimaginable force scoured the earth, wiping humanity from existence. Now, let's peel back the layers of this legend. Could the wind sun's collapse be more than just a tale? Modern science tells us that our planet has endured periods of extreme climate chaos, times when storms of terrifying power reshaped landscapes. Geological records reveal evidence of ancient hypercanes, storms so massive they dwarf even the worst hurricanes we see today. Imagine winds strong enough to flatten forests, storm surges that swallowed coastlines, and rains that lasted for months. For early civilizations, surviving such events would have felt like surviving the wrath of the gods, and here's the striking part. The Aztec myth describes the wind sun's end as a time when the winds themselves became sentient, tearing apart everything in their path. This isn't just poetic exaggeration, it's a chillingly accurate depiction of what hypercanes might have looked like to those who witnessed them. Some researchers point to sediment layers in Mesoamerica, showing signs of catastrophic flooding and wind damage dating back thousands of years. These aren't just random disasters, they line up with periods of abrupt climate shifts, moments when the weather itself seemed to turn against humanity. But why would the Aztecs remember these events as divine punishment? Think about it. Without modern science, how else would you explain storms that could level entire villages? It's no surprise that these disasters were woven into myth, framed as battles between gods or cosmic resets. The Wind-Sun story might be a survival memory, a warning passed down through generations about the raw power of nature. So when you hear about the hurricanes that ended the Wind-Sun, consider this. The Aztecs might have been preserving a real history, one written not in books, but in the very earth beneath our feet. And if that's true, then these myths aren't just stories, they're echoes of a time when the sky itself was the enemy. Yet the cycle of destruction wasn't finished. After the Wind-Sun's fury came an even more terrifying force, fire from the heavens. The Aztecs called it the Third Sun, an era that ended in a rain of flames so intense it turned the world to ash. But what if this wasn't just myth? What if it was a memory of something far more real? Picture this, a volcano erupting with such violence that the sky darkens for miles, rivers of molten rock swallowing entire cities, and ash falling like burning snow. This isn't just dramatic storytelling. It's exactly what happened around 2,000 years ago when Zittel, a volcano near the ancient city of Cuicuilco, exploded without warning. Archaeological digs reveal layers of volcanic rock buried beneath settlements, a silent testament to the disaster. And here's the chilling part: Cuicuilco was abandoned overnight, its people vanishing into history, leaving behind only scorched ruins. Now think about the Aztec myth. The Third Sun's destruction is described as a rain of fire, a punishment from the gods, but could it actually be a retelling of Zittel's eruption? The timelines match, the descriptions match, even the aftermath matches. Myths often speak of survivors fleeing to higher ground, just as real-life refugees would have done to escape lava flows. But the evidence doesn't stop there. Across Mesoamerica, other volcanic eruptions left their mark. Ash deposits in lake beds, pottery shards melted by extreme heat, even ancient artworks depicting fiery skies, all hint at a time when the earth itself seemed to rebel. For the Aztecs, these events wouldn't have been mere geology. They would have been cosmic battles, the gods reshaping the world through fire and chaos. So when the myth talks about the Third Sun's fiery end, remember, this might be more than legend. It could be a coded history, a way for survivors to make sense of the unimaginable. And if that's true, then these stories aren't just about the past. They're a warning about the power sleeping beneath our feet, waiting to wake again. But just as the earth recovered from fire, water rose to claim its turn. The Aztecs spoke of the Fourth Sun, an age drowned in a catastrophic flood so vast it swallowed the world whole. Sound familiar? Flood myths echo across nearly every ancient culture, from Noah's Ark to the Epic of Gilgamesh. But here's the twist: the Aztec version might hold clues to a real geological upheaval. Imagine glaciers melting at the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. Sea levels surged by hundreds of feet, reshaping coastlines and drowning entire landscapes. For early Mesoamericans living near what's now the Gulf of Mexico, this wouldn't have been a slow process. It would have felt like the gods unleashing their wrath. Now, zoom in closer to the Aztec heartland, Lake Texcoco, the vast body of water surrounding their capital, Tenochtitlan, was prone to violent flooding. Spanish chronicles describe how entire neighborhoods vanished underwater during storms. Could generations of these disasters have fused into the myth of the water sun? The evidence piles up. Sediment cores from the region show layers of silt and debris consistent with massive floods. Even the Aztec creation story describes survivors clinging to trees or transforming into fish, details eerily similar to real-life escape strategies during inundations. And let's not forget their sacred city. Tenochtitlan was built on islands, a deliberate choice that might have been inspired by ancestral memories of avoiding floodwaters. But here's the real kicker. The Aztecs weren't just retelling local disasters. Their flood myth aligns with global patterns, from submerged ruins off India's coast to the Black Sea's ancient deluge. Humanity's collective memory seems haunted by water. So when the Aztecs warned that the fourth sun ended in a flood, they might have been preserving a truth, one written not in stone, but in the rising tides of history. And if water once reshaped their world, what does that mean for ours? As we face rising seas today, these ancient stories start to feel less like myths and more like prophecies. Now, let's step into the era we're living in, the fifth sun, the age of motion. Unlike the previous cataclysms, this one isn't about destruction by jaguars, wind, fire, or water. Instead, the Aztecs believed this age would end if the sun stopped moving across the sky, and to prevent that, they performed blood sacrifices, believing the gods needed human energy to keep the cosmos in balance. But what if this wasn't just a grim ritual? What if it was a coded warning about real threats to their world? Think about it. The Aztecs lived in a time of immense political and environmental instability. Droughts, famines, and wars were constant threats. Their empire relied on a delicate balance, trade networks, agriculture, and tribute systems, all of which could collapse if the natural order was disrupted. The idea that the sun might stop moving could have been a metaphor for societal breakdown. If the state failed, if crops withered, if chaos took over, it would have felt like the world itself was ending. But there's another layer here: celestial events. The Aztecs were master astronomers, tracking the movements of the sun, moon, and planets with precision. Solar eclipses, when the sun seems to vanish, would have been terrifying. Without modern science, they might have interpreted these events as the sun literally stalling. And if eclipses coincided with disasters like droughts or invasions, it would have reinforced their belief that blood sacrifice was necessary to restore balance. The chilling part: this myth might have been a self-fulfilling prophecy. As droughts worsened and resources dwindled, the Aztecs increased sacrifices, hoping to appease the gods. But the very act of taking so many lives, especially during crises, could have weakened their society further. It's a stark reminder of how myths can shape reality, for better or worse. So when the Aztecs spoke of the fifth sun hanging by a thread, they might have been describing something far more real than we once thought, not just a cosmic warning, but a mirror held up to their own fragile world. And that raises a haunting question: what mirrors are we ignoring today? Now, let's turn our attention to a civilization that may have shaped the Aztec creation story in ways we're only beginning to understand: Teotihuacan. Long before the Aztecs rose to power, this ancient city thrived, only to collapse mysteriously around the year 600, but its legacy didn't vanish. When the Aztecs discovered Teotihuacan's ruins centuries later, they called it the City of the Gods, believing it was the birthplace of the fifth sun. The parallels between their myths and Teotihuacan's history are striking. The Aztec story of the gods sacrificing themselves to create the sun mirrors Teotihuacan's own iconography, pyramids adorned with symbols of sacrifice and rebirth. The Pyramid of the Sun, one of Teotihuacan's most imposing structures, aligns with the Aztec belief in solar cycles. Even the layout of the city, with its grand avenues and ceremonial plazas, echoes the Aztec vision of a cosmic order maintained through ritual. But here's where it gets fascinating. Teotihuacan's collapse wasn't just a historical event. It might have been woven into Aztec theology as a cautionary tale. Archaeologists believe the city fell due to a combination of drought, internal strife, and possibly even revolt. Sound familiar? These are the same threats the Aztecs feared would end their own world. By incorporating Teotihuacan's fate into their myths, they could have been preserving a warning. Civilizations rise and fall, often by the same forces. The shared imagery goes deeper. Teotihuacan's art is filled with feathered serpents, a motif the Aztecs later associated with Quetzalcoatl. Even the Aztec practice of human sacrifice finds eerie precedents in Teotihuacan's mass graves. It's as if the Aztecs looked at this abandoned city and saw not just ruins, but a divine blueprint, a story of creation and destruction they needed to remember. So when the Aztecs spoke of the fifth sun's fragility, they might have been thinking of Teotihuacan's fate, a once great city reduced to rubble, serving as both inspiration and omen. And that raises a compelling question. Did the Aztecs borrow their creation story not just from the gods, but from the ashes of a civilization that came before? Now let's look to the skies, because the Aztec creation myth might not just be rooted in earthly events, but in the stars themselves. The story of the five suns could be more than a theological narrative. It might be a celestial map, encoding real astronomical phenomena witnessed by ancient Mesoamericans. Take the 1054 supernova, for example. This colossal stellar explosion was so bright it would have been visible even during the day for nearly a month. Records from China and the Middle East confirm its appearance, but could the Aztecs have seen it too? While their empire hadn't yet risen, earlier Mesoamerican cultures like the Maya were meticulous sky watchers, tracking planetary movements and recording cosmic events. If knowledge of this supernova survived through oral tradition, it's possible the Aztecs wove it into their mythos, perhaps as one of the cataclysms that ended a previous sun. Then there's the question of planetary alignments. The Aztecs believed the fifth sun required constant sacrifice to keep moving across the sky. But what if this idea stemmed from observing rare celestial events, like Venus eclipsing the Sun or Jupiter aligning with Mars? These moments would have been awe-inspiring, even terrifying, for cultures who saw the heavens as divine. A sudden darkness during an eclipse or an unusually bright star like Venus could easily be interpreted as the sun faltering, needing blood offerings to regain strength. Even comets might hold a clue. Many ancient societies viewed them as omens of disaster, and the Aztecs were no exception. A spectacular comet sighting could have been remembered as the fiery destruction of the third sun, or the chaotic winds of the second. The key here is timing. If a major comet passed overhead during a period of drought or war, it's easy to see how the event would merge with myth, becoming a divine punishment. So were the five suns just stories, or a way to make sense of the cosmos? The answer might lie in both. For the Aztecs, the sky wasn't just a backdrop, it was a living record, where gods and disasters played out in real time. And if their myths preserved these celestial events, It means their creation story wasn't just about the past, it was a warning written in the stars. Next, we'll explore an even darker aspect of Aztec belief, the role of human sacrifice. Was it purely ritual, or a desperate response to real crises? The answer might surprise you. But let's turn our attention from the skies to the temples where the Aztecs performed their most infamous rituals. Human sacrifice is often seen as the darkest chapter of their civilization. But what if it wasn't just about appeasing the gods? What if it was a survival strategy, twisted by time into something far more ritualistic? Consider this: the Aztec Empire faced constant threats, droughts, famines, wars. In times of extreme scarcity, some scholars argue that sacrifices might have been a grim form of population control. The idea isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Other cultures, like the Maya during the classic collapse, show evidence of crisis-driven cannibalism. Could the Aztecs have adapted similar practices, later sanctifying them as divine commands? Archaeology adds another layer. Mass graves near temples, like those at the Templo Mayor, reveal skeletons with cut marks consistent with ritual sacrifice. But here's the twist: many victims were warriors or prisoners from conquered cities. This suggests sacrifice wasn't just about feeding the gods, it was a tool of political terror, a way to weaken enemies and deter rebellion. The line between ritual and warfare blurs. Then there's the nutritional angle. In a 1970 study, anthropologist Marvin Harris proposed that sacrificial victims, often high in protein, might have supplemented diets during famines. While controversial, it's a reminder that ancient peoples made brutal choices under pressure. Over centuries, these pragmatic acts could have morphed into sacred duties, their original purpose lost to myth. Yet not all sacrifices fit this theory. Children offered to Tlaloc, the rain god, were often buried with tears carved into their cheeks, a plea for rainfall. Here, the ritual seems purely spiritual, tied to agricultural cycles rather than survival. So which was it? The answer likely lies in both. Sacrifice was a complex tapestry, woven from desperation, power, and genuine belief. As we piece together these clues, one thing becomes clear: the Aztecs weren't mindless fanatics. They were people responding to a harsh world with the tools they had, sometimes practical, sometimes terrifying. Next, we'll meet the god who tried to change it all, Quetzalcoatl. Was he a deity, a reformer, or something in between? The mystery deepens. Now, let's shift our focus to one of the most enigmatic figures in Aztec mythology, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. Was this revered deity purely a creation of myth, or could he have been inspired by a real historical figure? The answer might lie in the blurred lines between legend and history. Take Topotzin Quetzalcoatl, a ruler of the ancient city of Chala. Stories describe him as a wise and benevolent leader who rejected human sacrifice, promoting peace and prosperity instead. His reign ended in exile, with prophecies claiming he'd one day return. Sound familiar? This narrative mirrors the Aztec myth of Quetzalcoatl, who is said to have left in disgrace, vowing to come back and reclaim his kingdom. Could these tales be two versions of the same story? It's possible. Ancient cultures often deified great leaders, transforming their lives into legends. If Topotzin was a real reformer, his ideals might have been preserved and exaggerated over centuries, morphing into the god we know today. The parallels are striking. Both figures are associated with wind, wisdom, and a deep connection to creation. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, some Aztecs initially mistook Hernán Cortés for Quetzalcoatl, believing the prophecy of his return had been fulfilled. This tragic misunderstanding suggests how deeply the legend was woven into their worldview. Whether Quetzalcoatl began as a man or a god, his story became a powerful symbol, one that shaped history itself. So, was Quetzalcoatl a divine being or a mortal immortalized by time? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Myths often anchor themselves in real events, twisting facts into something grander. And in Quetzalcoatl's case, that blend of history and divinity might just explain his enduring legacy. Next, we'll unravel another layer of Aztec symbolism, the cosmic battle between Huitzilopochtli and Coyolxauhqui. What hidden truths lie beneath this epic clash of gods? The answers might surprise you. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most dramatic stories in Aztec mythology, the cosmic battle between Huitzilopochtli and Coyolxauhqui. On the surface, it's a tale of divine vengeance, but dig deeper, and you'll find layers of political meaning that reflect the Aztec worldview. According to legend, Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess, led her 400 brothers in a plot to kill their mother, Coatlicue, after she became mysteriously pregnant. But her unborn son, Huitzilopochtli, sprang from the womb fully armed, decapitated Coyolxauhqui, and hurled her body down the sacred mountain. Gruesome. Absolutely, but this myth wasn't just about family drama, it was a metaphor for power. The Aztecs saw Huitzilopochtli as their patron god, the one who guided them to Tenochtitlan. His victory over Coyolxauhqui symbolized order triumphing over chaos, a theme central to their empire. And here's where it gets fascinating. The Templo Mayor, the heart of Aztec religion, was designed to mirror this myth. At its base, archaeologists discovered a massive stone disc depicting Coyolxauhqui's dismembered body, a chilling reminder of what happened to those who challenged Huitzilopochtli's authority. But was this just religious symbolism, or did it have real-world implications? Many scholars believe the myth served as political propaganda. The Aztecs were fierce conquerors, and Huitzilopochtli's ruthless victory may have justified their military campaigns. Enemies were like Coyolxauhqui, threats to be crushed to maintain cosmic balance. Even the 400 brothers might represent rival city-states, their defeat a warning to anyone who dared resist. This blend of myth and politics reveals how the Aztecs used stories to legitimize their rule. The Templo Mayor wasn't just a religious site, it was a statement. Every sacrifice, every ritual, reinforced the idea that their dominance was divinely ordained. So, while the battle between Huitzilopochtli and Coyolxauhqui might seem like pure mythology, it's also a window into the ruthless pragmatism of an empire. Next, we'll examine another piece of the puzzle, the Aztec codices. Could these ancient manuscripts hold hidden clues about real events disguised as myth? The answers might be more revealing than we think. Now, let's unravel the secrets hidden within the Aztec codices, those intricate, colorful manuscripts that serve as some of the most valuable windows into their world. Among these, the Codex Borgia and the Florentine Codex stand out not just as religious texts, but as potential records of real cataclysms veiled in symbolic art. Take the Codex Borgia, for instance. Its vivid illustrations of gods, celestial events, and destruction might seem purely mythological at first glance. But look closer, and you'll notice recurring imagery of floods, fiery skies, and crumbling temples. Could these be stylized accounts of actual disasters? Some researchers think so. The page depicting Tlaloc, the rain god, unleashing torrents of water might parallel the flooding of Lake Texcoco, while scenes of burning cities could echo volcanic eruptions like Zittle's devastation centuries earlier. Then there's the Florentine Codex, a monumental work compiled under Spanish supervision but based on Aztec testimonies. It's packed with descriptions of natural phenomena, earthquakes, droughts, even strange lights in the sky. One passage tells of a smoking star that appeared before a great famine. Was this a comet, a supernova? The Aztecs interpreted such events as divine omens, but modern science suggests they might have been recording observable cosmic occurrences. What makes these codices so intriguing is their blend of myth and potential eyewitness detail. The Aztecs didn't separate history from symbolism the way we do today. A depiction of Quetzalcoatl descending into the underworld might encode a solar eclipse, while a battle between gods could symbolize a political upheaval. The challenge is deciphering which elements are pure allegory and which hold kernels of truth. And here's the key: these manuscripts weren't just sacred texts, they were survival guides. By documenting past catastrophes in mythic terms, the Aztecs may have been preserving warnings for future generations. Whether it's a drought masked as Tlaloc's wrath or an earthquake framed as the earth monster shaking itself awake, the codices could be far more than stories. They might be history, written in the only language their creators knew. Next, we'll shift our gaze to the Earth itself. What if geological evidence could confirm the disasters hidden in these ancient pages? The ground beneath Mesoamerica might hold the proof we've been searching for, but let's dig deeper literally. Beneath the soil of Mesoamerica, the Earth itself might hold the answers we've been searching for. Geological evidence doesn't just support the Aztec creation myths, it breathes life into them, revealing scars of ancient disasters that mirror the cataclysms described in their stories. Take the basin of Mexico, where layers of sediment tell a dramatic tale. Core samples drilled from Lake Texcoco show sudden, massive deposits of volcanic ash, perfectly timed with the eruption of Zittel, a volcano that buried the city of Cuicuilco around 1,500 years ago. This wasn't just a minor event, it was an apocalypse, one that matches eerily well with the Aztec myth of the third sun's destruction by fire. Could the legend of cities consumed by flames be a distorted memory of this very eruption? Then there's the coastline of the Gulf of Mexico, where scientists have uncovered tsunami deposits dating back thousands of years. These colossal waves, likely triggered by underwater earthquakes or landslides, would have devastated coastal settlements. For a culture that revered the water sun's great flood, such a catastrophe would have been unforgettable. The myth might not just be symbolism, it could be a warning passed down through generations, a reminder of the ocean's fury. Even the Earth's cracks speak volumes. The trans-Mexican volcanic belt, a region riddled with fault lines, bears the marks of countless quakes. In places like Teotihuacan, archaeologists have found buildings with clear signs of seismic damage, their walls tilted or collapsed. When the Aztecs spoke of the earth monster, Tlaloctecutli, shaking violently, were they describing the terror of living in an earthquake-prone land? And let's not forget droughts. Tree rings from central Mexico reveal periods of severe aridity, particularly around the 9th century, a time when many Mesoamerican cities collapsed. The Aztecs blamed Tlaloc's anger for such suffering, but science points to climate shifts. These dry spells could have inspired the myth of the wind sun's destruction, where hurricanes and dust storms wiped out humanity. What's striking is how these geological clues align with the Aztec timeline of the 5 suns, each era's catastrophic end, whether fire, flood, or famine, finds a potential counterpart in the Earth's own record. It's as if the myths were pieced together from real trauma, woven into stories to make sense of the unimaginable. So, what does this mean for us? If the Aztecs were encoding real disasters into their cosmology, they weren't just storytellers, they were historians, using the only tools they had. And that raises a haunting question. If their myths were rooted in truth, could other ancient tales hold similar secrets? Next, we'll explore how time itself might have reshaped these stories, turning raw events into the legends we know today. Now, let's consider how time itself can reshape the truth. Stories passed down through generations don't stay frozen, they bend, stretch, and take on new meanings, especially when they're rooted in real, traumatic events. Think of it like a game of telephone, but played over centuries, where each retelling adds layers of symbolism, heroism, or divine intervention. Take the Trojan War, for example. Historians now believe it might have been inspired by real conflicts between Bronze Age civilizations, but over time, the story grew into a grand epic filled with gods, prophecies, and legendary heroes like Achilles. The same could easily have happened with the Aztec creation myths, a volcanic eruption that wiped out entire cities. Over generations, it becomes the third sun's destruction by fire, orchestrated by vengeful gods. A catastrophic flood, now it's the water sun's punishment, a divine reset for humanity. This isn't just speculation, it's how human memory works. When societies face disasters too overwhelming to explain, they often turn them into myths. The details blur, the causes become supernatural, and the survivors become part of something larger than themselves. For the Aztecs, weaving these events into their cosmology wasn't just about storytelling. It was a way to make sense of chaos, to find meaning in the unpredictable forces of nature. And here's the fascinating part. The more a story is retold, the more it adapts to the culture's current beliefs. Early versions of the Aztec myths might have been straightforward accounts of eruptions or floods, but as their society evolved, so did the narratives. Gods took center stage, rituals emerged to appease them, and what started as history became theology. This doesn't mean the myths are false, it means they're layered. Beneath the divine drama, there could very well be kernels of truth, echoes of real events that shaped the Aztec world. And if that's the case, it invites us to look at other ancient myths with fresh eyes. Could the great flood stories found across cultures all point to a shared memory of rising seas after the Ice Age? Could dragon legends be distorted accounts of dinosaur fossils? The Aztec creation story, then, isn't just a tale, it's a puzzle, one where history and belief intertwine. And as we piece it together, we're not just uncovering their past. We're learning how all civilizations, including our own, turn trauma into tradition. Next, we'll see how these myths compare to other cultures, revealing surprising patterns that stretch across the globe. Now, let's step back and see how the Aztec creation myth fits into a much larger tapestry, one that stretches across continents and cultures. It turns out, the idea of cyclical destruction and rebirth isn't unique to the Aztecs. In fact, you'll find eerily similar stories in civilizations that never even crossed paths with Mesoamerica. Take the Hindu concept of the yugas, for instance. Like the five suns, these are vast cosmic ages, each ending in catastrophe before a new era begins. The Kali Yuga, our current age, is said to be one of strife and decline, destined to collapse before the cycle renews. Sound familiar? It's almost like different cultures were observing the same patterns: natural disasters, societal collapses, and weaving them into their own cosmological frameworks. Then there's the Greek myth of the ages of man, where humanity progresses through golden, silver, bronze, and iron ages, each worse than the last. The parallels here are striking. Just as the Aztecs believed their current era, the fifth sun, was fragile and required sacrifice to sustain, the Greeks saw their Iron Age as a time of hardship and moral decay. Both myths reflect a deep-seated anxiety about the fragility of civilization and the looming threat of collapse. Even more fascinating are the flood myths found everywhere from Mesopotamia to the Andes. The Aztec water sun's deluge mirrors the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh and the biblical story of Noah, tales of divine wrath wiping the slate clean. Could these all be distant memories of real, ancient floods? Geologists point to evidence of massive sea level rises at the end of the last ice age, events dramatic enough to leave a mark on collective human memory. What does this tell us? That when faced with cataclysm, humans everywhere seem to reach for the same narrative tools. Disasters become divine punishments. Chaos gets personified as gods or monsters, and the cycle of destruction and renewal offers a kind of comfort, a promise that no matter how bad things get, the world will begin again. This isn't just about shared stories, it's about shared psychology. Whether it's the Aztecs, the Greeks, or the Hindus, these myths reveal how cultures process trauma, turning raw fear into something meaningful. And that might be the most human thing of all. Up next, we'll zoom in on one of the Aztec gods, Tlaloc, and see how his myths might hide clues about real environmental crises that shaped their world. Now, let's turn our attention to Tlaloc, the Aztec god of rain, but not just any rain. This was the deity who controlled life, giving storms and punishing droughts, a force as fickle as the weather itself. The myths surrounding Tlaloc aren't just stories. They might be echoes of real environmental disasters that brought entire civilizations to their knees. Picture this, a world where rain doesn't fall for years, crops wither, rivers dry up, and hunger spreads like wildfire. For the Aztecs, this wasn't just a nightmare, it was a recurring reality. Tlaloc's wrath, as described in their myths, often took the form of withheld rains or devastating floods, a duality that mirrored the unpredictable climate of Mesoamerica. But here's where it gets interesting. Archaeologists have found evidence of prolonged droughts that coincided with the collapse of powerful cities, like those of the classic Maya. Could Tlaloc's myths be a way of explaining these catastrophic dry spells? The Aztecs believed that children sacrificed to Tlaloc would become his helpers, ensuring rain for the crops. It's a grim ritual, but when you think about it, it reflects a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable. Droughts weren't just weather events, they were existential threats. And when the rains failed, societies crumbled. We see this pattern across history. The Maya collapse around the 9th century, for instance, lines up with sediment records showing severe droughts. It's almost as if Tlaloc's mythology was a way of encoding these traumatic events into something the Aztecs could comprehend, and perhaps even influence. But Tlaloc wasn't just a destroyer. His storms also brought renewal, refilling lakes and nourishing the soil. This duality, destruction, and rebirth mirrors the cyclical nature of the Aztec creation myth itself. It's a reminder that even in the face of disaster, there's always the hope of renewal. Up next, we'll take a closer look at the Aztec Sun Stone, a monument often seen as a calendar. But what if it's also a record of past catastrophes, hidden in plain sight? Now, let's shift our focus to one of the most iconic artifacts of the Aztec world, the Sun Stone. Often called the Aztec Calendar Stone, this massive carving is usually interpreted as a complex timekeeping device. But what if it's more than that? What if the symbols etched into its surface aren't just marking days, but also preserving memories of cataclysmic events. Take a closer look at the sunstone's intricate design. At its center, you'll find the face of Tanadia, the sun god, surrounded by 4 previous eras, the 4 suns that were destroyed before the current one. Each of these eras ended in disaster, from jaguars tearing humanity apart to hurricanes and floods wiping out civilizations. Could these symbols be more than myth? Could they be a coded record of real historical catastrophes? Archaeologists have long debated the purpose of the sunstone. While it does function as a calendar, tracking the Aztec solar year and sacred cycles, some researchers argue it also serves as a warning. The repeated imagery of destruction and rebirth mirrors the Aztecs' own experiences with environmental upheaval, droughts, volcanic eruptions, even the occasional comet streaking across the sky. These weren't just stories, they were events that shaped their world. Consider this: the Aztecs didn't have written history as we know it. Instead, they recorded knowledge through symbols and oral tradition. The sunstone might be their way of preserving the lessons of the past, ensuring future generations remembered the dangers of a collapsing world. The 4 previous suns could represent actual epochs of disaster, each one a cautionary tale about the fragility of civilization. And here's something even more intriguing. The stone's outer ring features symbols of fire and water, elements tied to destruction in Aztec mythology. But they are also tied to real phenomena, volcanic eruptions, floods, and even celestial events like meteor showers. Could the sunstone be a blend of myth and memory, a way to encode survival knowledge in stone? As we piece together these clues, it's clear the sunstone isn't just a calendar, it's a monument to resilience, a reminder that even in the face of disaster, life finds a way to continue. Up next, we'll explore how Spanish colonization reshaped these myths, blurring the line between history and legend. But the story doesn't end there. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, they didn't just conquer the Aztecs, they reshaped their myths. The colonizers saw the Aztec creation stories as pagan tales that needed to be replaced or rewritten to fit Christian beliefs. This wasn't just about religion, it was about control. By altering the narratives, the Spanish could distance the Aztecs from their own history, making it easier to impose a new worldview. Take the figure of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god. In original Aztec tradition, he was a creator deity associated with wisdom and wind. But after the conquest, Spanish chroniclers began blending his story with Christian elements, even suggesting he might have been a bearded, pale-skinned figure, echoing European descriptions of Jesus or saints. This wasn't coincidence. It was a deliberate effort to make native beliefs seem like a distorted version of Christianity, implying the Aztecs had been waiting for the true faith all along. The same thing happened with the creation myths themselves. The Spanish friars who recorded Aztec stories often filtered them through a Christian lens. For example, the flood that destroyed the 4th sun might have been compared to Noah's Ark, while the sacrifices meant to sustain the 5th sun were framed as barbaric practices rather than a complex cosmological duty. These reinterpretations didn't just change the details, they obscured the potential historical truths buried in the myths. Even the sunstone, which we just discussed, wasn't immune. After the conquest, it was buried face down beneath Mexico City's main square, as if to symbolically suppress the old beliefs. When it was rediscovered centuries later, its original context had been lost, leaving scholars to piece together its meaning without the full cultural framework. The Spanish didn't just rewrite history, they fragmented it. Yet despite all this, traces of the original stories survived. Indigenous scribes working under Spanish rule sometimes slipped older truths into their records, hiding them in symbols or double meanings. And oral traditions kept fragments alive in secret, passed down through generations. The myths were bent, but not entirely broken. So what does this mean for our search for historical truth? It means we have to read between the lines, separating the Aztec voice from the colonial overlay, because somewhere beneath the rewritten narratives, the real story might still be waiting. Next, we'll see how modern science is helping to uncover those lost truths, using tools the Spanish never could have imagined. But now, let's turn to the tools of modern science, because today, researchers aren't just interpreting old stories. They're using hard evidence to test whether the Aztec creation myths might hold kernels of truth. Archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient cultures understood the stars, has been especially revealing. Scholars like Anthony Aveni have spent decades decoding Mesoamerican astronomical records, and what they've found is fascinating. The Aztecs didn't just watch the sky for rituals. They tracked planetary movements, eclipses, and even supernovas with startling precision. Take the 5-sun cycle. Could these eras correspond to real celestial events? Aveni's research suggests that the Aztecs might have recorded the supernova of 1054, which lit up the sky so brightly it was visible even during the day. Some scholars argue this could have inspired the fiery destruction of the third sun or the birth of the fifth. Others point to the Venus cycle, which the Aztecs tied to Quetzalcoatl's mythic journeys. When Venus appeared as the morning star, it signaled renewal, echoing the creation myth's theme of cyclical rebirth. Then there's geology. Scientists studying sediment layers around Lake Texcoco have found evidence of catastrophic floods, volcanic ash deposits, and even earthquake damage, all events that align eerily with the mythic disasters described in the 5 suns. For example, the eruption of the Zittel volcano around 1,700 years ago buried entire cities under lava, mirroring the reign of fire that ended the third sun. And core samples reveal periods of extreme drought, which could explain Tlaloc's wrath in the myths. Of course, not all scholars agree. Some argue that these connections are coincidental, that the myths are purely symbolic, not historical. But even skeptics admit the Aztecs were meticulous observers of their world. Whether they were encoding real disasters or crafting metaphors for cosmic order, their stories were deeply rooted in the natural phenomena around them. So where does that leave us? Science can't prove the myths true, but it shows us how they might have emerged from real experiences. The sky and earth were their textbooks, and their stories, whether memory or metaphor, were written in the language of both. Next, we'll hear from the skeptics, who argue that sometimes a myth is just a myth. Now, let's consider the other side of the debate, because not everyone believes these myths are rooted in real events. For some scholars, the Aztec creation story is purely symbolic, a grand metaphor for the human condition rather than a record of ancient disasters. Take Miguel León Portilla, one of the most respected voices in Mesoamerican studies. He argued that the 5 suns weren't meant to describe literal catastrophes, but to explore deeper philosophical questions about time, sacrifice, and the fragile balance of the universe. Think about it this way: the Aztecs lived in a world where nature was unpredictable. Volcanic eruptions, droughts, and floods weren't just threats. They were reminders of how easily life could unravel. The myth of the 5 suns, in this view, wasn't a history lesson. It was a way to make sense of chaos, to explain why the world demanded blood and sweat to keep functioning. The gods' sacrifices weren't echoes of real events, but reflections of human struggles, dressed in divine language. And let's not forget the political angle. The Aztec Empire was built on conquest, and their myths often served as propaganda. Huitzilopochtli's victory over Coyolxauhqui, for example, wasn't just a celestial battle. It mirrored the Aztecs' own rise to power, justifying their dominance over rival cities. In this light, the creation story becomes less about geology and more about ideology, a tool to unite people under a shared destiny. Even the astronomical connections, while compelling, might be overinterpreted. Sure, the Aztecs tracked Venus and supernovas, but so did many ancient cultures. That doesn't mean every celestial event inspired a myth. Sometimes, as skeptics point out, a story is just a story, a way to pass down wisdom, not a hidden record of disasters. So where does that leave us? Whether you see the myths as coded history or pure symbolism, one thing's clear: the Aztecs were master storytellers. Their tales were layered, rich with meaning, and designed to resonate across generations. Next, we'll tackle some of the wilder theories, because if you think aliens or ancient tech might be involved, well, you're in for a ride. Now, let's venture into the realm of the extraordinary, because when it comes to ancient myths, some theories take a decidedly sci-fi turn. Could the Aztec creation story hint at encounters with advanced beings or forgotten technology? It's a tantalizing idea, and one that's captured imaginations for decades. Proponents of these fringe theories point to the plumed serpent god Quetzalcoatl, often depicted as a celestial being with otherworldly knowledge. Some even suggest he might represent an alien visitor, sharing wisdom that seemed miraculous to ancient eyes. Then there's the Sun Stone, with its intricate carvings and precise astronomical alignments. Could it be more than a calendar, perhaps a relic of lost technology, or a device meant to communicate with the stars? And what about the mythic battles between gods, described with fiery explosions and earth-shaking force? To some, these sound less like divine conflicts and more like distorted memories of advanced machinery or even aerial combat. But before we get carried away, let's ground this in reality. While these ideas are fun to speculate about, the evidence just isn't there. Archaeologists haven't uncovered ancient microchips or spacecraft in Mesoamerica. The Sunstone's precision, while impressive, fits within the known astronomical expertise of the Aztecs. No extraterrestrial intervention required, and Quetzalcoatl's symbolism aligns neatly with Mesoamerican beliefs about wisdom and renewal, not interstellar travel. The truth is, human creativity is more than capable of crafting grand myths without outside help. The Aztecs were brilliant observers of their world, weaving their knowledge of nature, politics, and philosophy into stories that still captivate us today. So while the idea of ancient astronauts or high-tech relics makes for great storytelling, the real magic lies in understanding how these myths reflect the ingenuity of the people who created them. With that said, let's turn our attention to the bigger picture, because whether you see these tales as history, metaphor, or something else entirely, they offer a fascinating window into how the Aztecs made sense of their world. Now, stepping back to see the bigger picture, what does all this mean for how we understand the Aztecs? If their creation myths weren't just symbolic tales, but echoes of real disasters, it changes everything about how we view their resilience and their bond with the natural world. Imagine living in a landscape where the earth itself could erupt, where storms could wipe out entire generations, and where the sun's movement felt uncertain. For the Aztecs, these weren't abstract fears, they were woven into their very understanding of existence. Their myths didn't just explain the past, they prepared them for the future. The cyclical nature of the five suns, with each era ending in catastrophe, wasn't just storytelling, it was a survival manual. By framing destruction as inevitable but temporary, they built a worldview that embraced impermanence and adaptation. This perspective also reshapes how we see their infamous rituals, like human sacrifice. If the gods demanded blood to keep the sun moving, it wasn't just blind devotion. It was a desperate bargain with forces they believed had wiped out civilizations before. In a world where nature was both provider and destroyer, their ceremonies were acts of negotiation, attempts to maintain balance in an unpredictable universe. And then there's their relationship with the land itself. The Aztecs didn't just inhabit their environment, they revered it as a living, breathing force. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was a marvel of engineering, built on a lake with floating gardens and aqueducts, a testament to their ability to thrive in harmony with nature's challenges. If their myths encoded real disasters, then their innovations weren't just practical, they were acts of defiance against a world that had already ended multiple times. So, what does this mean for us today? The Aztec stories remind us that resilience isn't about avoiding collapse, it's about learning to rebuild. Their myths, whether rooted in history or not, teach us that civilizations don't endure by ignoring the forces around them, but by adapting, honoring, and sometimes even bargaining with them. In a time of climate crises and environmental uncertainty, maybe there's wisdom in that ancient perspective, a reminder that survival isn't just about strength, but about understanding the rhythms of the world we live in. With that in mind, let's turn to our final thoughts, because whether these myths hold fragments of truth or pure symbolism, they've left us with a legacy far richer than we might have imagined. So, where does this leave us? After piecing together the fragments, geological records, astronomical alignments, and the echoes of ancient disasters, it's hard to ignore the possibility that the Aztec creation myth was more than just a story. The Jaguar Sun's reign of predators mirrors the era of megafauna. The wind sun's catastrophic storms align with evidence of prehistoric climate chaos. The reign of fire, a haunting parallel to volcanic eruptions that scarred Mesoamerica, and the Great Flood, a memory of rising waters that reshaped the land. Even the fifth sun's demand for blood sacrifice takes on new meaning when seen as a desperate plea to stave off collapse in a world that had already ended 4 times before. The Aztecs didn't just invent these tales, they lived them. Their myths were a tapestry woven from trauma, resilience, and an unshakable understanding that nature was both creator and destroyer. And if their stories were indeed warnings, passed down through generations, then the real question isn't whether they were based on real events, it's whether we're willing to hear them. In an age of climate, upheaval, and ecological reckoning, the Aztecs' cyclical view of history feels eerily prophetic. They knew that survival wasn't about conquering nature, but learning its rhythms and respecting its power. So, let's turn it over to you. Did the Aztecs preserve a warning from the past? And are we listening? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into myth and history as fascinating as we did, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more explorations into the mysteries of the ancient world, and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.